Creatine isn't new, but the way it's been talked about in gyms, on TikTok, on social feeds, pretty darn confusing. It's one of the most studied supplements in modern nutrition, and somehow still totally misunderstood. You have people completely scared that it will wreck their kidneys. Others think that it's some steroid-like shortcut. Others believe that maybe it just completely bloats them and it's not worth it. But the real question is, do you even really know what you're putting in your body? Would you eat beef that came from an over-processed, disease-ridden cow, entrusted to fuel your body the same way that a grass-fed, pasture-raised, grass-finished, nice steak would? That's what I want to explore today, because not all creatine is created equal. And today's guest, he's the one guy on this planet who can separate the noise from the truth.
And so if you just did resistance training, most people can gain, studies show, about a third to a half a pound of muscle a month. If you take creatine, you almost double that. So if you take creatine, for example, studies show, and you took it for a month, or initial studies, our athletes taking creatine would gain 2.4 kgs of muscle mass versus only about 1.1 kg with.
Dr. Richard Kreider isn't just a scientist. He's published thousands of research articles, and he's the guy that companies call when they want real answers. His work has helped define the science of performance, and he's here today to help us ask and answer the questions that no one else is asking. Dr. Kreider, before we really dive into what creatine is, what really drew you into this type of research? I mean, why this structure, this component out of all other things that you could have spent? I mean, you're probably the world's most renowned researcher on this topic, and you have probably the most published articles out there, and a lot of people come to you for this. So why did you choose this? I mean, back in when you first started, why this? Why not something?
Well, I first started in this field wanting to be a strength coach. And I was graduated high school in 80 and college, played college football in 84, was very interested in strength conditioning. That's right when strength conditioning started. And of course, nutrition was a big role in that. So my favorite classes in college were nutrition and exercise physiology and kinesiology. And I went to grad school to be a strength coach, and then I got interested in research. And they kept on saying, you're doing pretty good at this. Why don't you go a little farther? And I did. And I had an opportunity early in my career to do performance enhancement work. And so nutrition's key to that. You can't optimize performance without nutrition and training. And so I also was able to work my first position and as a professor was Old Dominion University, working with one of the pioneers of ergogenic aid research, which was Mel Williams. And so we did a number of studies, both interested in exercise, nutrition, performance enhancement. And early on in my career, creatine came up as a potential ergogenic aid. I was interested in strength conditioning. It looked like it was going to improve strength. And I was interested to see how it would affect muscle mass and training adaptations. So we really did the first study in the United States on athletes and looking at whether it would be a training aid or ergogenic aid in resistance trained athletes. And so from that point on, we just did study after study on different forms and health aspects and all types of areas of creatine and on safety. And so that's kind of how it started. You're one of the first ones doing that type of work, and it's blossomed now from a supplement good for just athletes and training to now something that has widespread application throughout the lifespan for health as well.
Was it because as you were researching creatine that you got into this kind of mode, like kind of vortex of questions? You'd hit a point, you'd do a study. I'm assuming these were human studies, right? Human trials. You would do these studies, and then when you guys were doing these studies, I'm assuming there were other thoughts like, okay, so now this worked, but how is it affecting the rest of the body, or how is it affecting?
Yeah, so it's a perfect example. Creatine's a perfect example of how you can use one nutrient and then try to look at how it affects the body in a number of ways. When we first started creatine supplementation, the initial studies out of England, out of United Kingdom with Dr. Harris, was it would increase energy in the muscle, increase explosive energy capacity for repetitions and maximal effort. And that was all we really knew about it. You consumed a lot, kind of like carbohydrate loading. It would then increase in the muscle, and you have more energy. And so we first went into creatine thinking it was just an ergogenic aid for power athletes. And as we started doing studies and started giving enough creatine for, our first study was a month, and we saw this tremendous increase in strength and endurance, but also muscle mass gain. And that made us think, well, how is muscle mass gaining that short in that short a time? So then that spun us off into different studies. We then started doing how it affect athletes and during off-season conditioning drills in hypertrophy phase and football players. That was our second study. We then started thinking if it improves in sprinting, how about let's see how it affects adolescent elite level swimmers and their repeated swimming performances. Then we did a training study on creatine for all spring training, and every study started adding more information about what creatine can do. So after we did the initial studies on different types of creatine, we then started thinking, well, what if we add different things to creatine? We take it with carbs, take it with protein. Does that add greater adaptations? And then there were a lot of comments about safety, so we did a bunch of safety studies. So if you look at the studies over the years, they started out with performance and now have gone into how different other nutrients can add to a creatine effect, or creatine can add to that effect. And then not only in athletes and training, but middle age and elderly, and now looking at all type of disease applications with it as well. So every study adds to the next one, gives you more questions. Then you want to try to get funding to do some more studies on it. So we've been blessed to be able to do lots of creatine studies over the years, and had a lot of publications and things from that. And we were in the bottom floor, the beginning of it, especially in the United States. And the boom of creatine kind of grew out of a lot of that initial research.
So I was one of those athletes in high school and college, and primarily in high school. I remember my brother always telling me, you know, you don't even know what you're putting in your body. And I remember talking to my chemistry teacher in high school. This is back in the 90s. And I asked him, what is, creatine? Like, where does it come from? Because we were talking about creatine, and I was taking it as a supplement for lifting at the time. And I'm catching a lot of flack from my brother, who's like, hey, that's not natural. You don't even know what you put in your body, type of thing. And I want to get into that here in a second. But I was my own test subject, and I saw the gains. I saw the benefits from it. And my chemistry teacher told me that it was creatinine, and that creatinine comes from muscle. And I think maybe I misunderstood him, or maybe he was misunderstood in the way that he was explaining it. But my understanding is creatinine is the waste product of creatine, and creatine is the product that is found within meat or within muscle tissue. Mm-hmm. So can you clarify that a little bit? Like, how does creatine get used in the muscle? I mean, it's kind of like this, someone takes a supplement and they just take it, but they don't really know how it's absorbed and used in the body.
So when you consume creatine in a diet, from meat and fish like salmon, or take supplemental creatine like creatine monohydrate, it increases the levels of creatine in the blood, and then they go through transporters and stores more creatine in the muscle. When you increase creatine in the muscle by 10, 20, 30% or so from loading or taking creatine, it increases the availability of the primary energy system for high-intensity exercise. If you go back to chemistry, remember the ATP-PC system, the phosphogen system, and this is the immediate source of energy. Our primary source of energy is adenosine triphosphate, ATP, and you only have a limited amount, but the phosphocreatine is broken down to provide energy to replenish that ATP, and that allows you to sprint longer. Instead of wearing out and getting tired after 2 seconds of sprint, that PC allows you to sprint for 5, 6, 8, 10 seconds before you start using carbohydrate as a primary fuel. And so by increasing creatine in the muscle, you increase immediate source of energy for explosive exercise. And it facilitates recovery from intense sprinting. So the initial thought was, let's load the muscle with creatine, kind of like we carbohydrate load for an endurance athlete to give them more glycogen to last longer during a run. But if we load more creatine in muscle, we should be able to sprint longer, faster, and recover faster between sprints. So that was the initial thought. This is an ergogenic aid for explosive, high-intensity exercise. So things like a 60-meter, 100-meter sprint, repeated sprints in like football or basketball, where you're jogging and sprinting, or in weightlifting, where you're doing sets and reps of 4 or 5, 6 or so reps, where you can get more power and more repetitions done and lift more weight to improve quality of training. So it's energy in the muscle. And it's not just in the muscle. Every cell stores creatine, including the brain and heart and testes and all parts of the body. And we're now knowing that because creatine plays a critical role, especially when there's a lack of oxygen supply to tissue, like ischemic heart disease or something, or stroke, that creatine serves as a backup energy source to keep and maintain cell function. And even things like in cancer, there are tumors that are heavily dependent on creatine. And if you don't have enough creatine, you actually have more tumor growth. And so there's now all these applications where, because creatine is critical for cellular metabolism, it has applications not only for sprinting, but for all metabolic functions, particularly if the body's under stress, like in a disease situation or a heavy training exercise situation. So it's basically energy for the cell, and that makes the cell be able to function better.
So if we were to break this down in its simplest form, if I were to say my muscle has, my legs, for example, that are being used for a quick 60-meter sprint or 100-meter sprint, there's a certain amount of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And when we break that bond, we have adenosine diphosphate. Now we're getting into a little bit of the scientific terms here. The phosphocreatine, the phosphate form. Are you saying that if I have more phosphocreatine in the cell itself, that it essentially breaks apart to provide another phosphate to create more ATP? Because when we use that ATP, we get ADP, right? And the phosphate then is kind of free roaming, or wherever it goes. Right.
When you cleave off the phosphate from ATP or phosphocreatine, you get energy, and that free energy is used for muscle contraction. So you break down ATP, you get 7.3 kcals, right? Energy. But when you break down phosphocreatine, you get 10.3. So you have enough energy to resynthesize that ATP. So when you start sprinting, you're breaking down ATP, and the PC energy from that breakdown is used to replenish it. So you're basically turning your ATP over, and the faster and more rapid you can turn that over, the longer you can maintain an all-out maximal sprint.
So is there a number? I don't know if this can even be measured. Is there a number of maybe the number of ATP molecules that are within a cell that, like, you have a saturation limit, and once you add in that phosphocreatine, there may also be a saturation limit where you can have so many of those. So you kind of like if you think of the analogy of a vehicle, right? You're filling up your car with fuel. You're filling up your cells with this fuel. Is there a point in which you can't fuel it anymore? You can't overfill that tank?
Yes and no. If we can get the components of ATP, the components of phosphate and creatine, more in the cell, you should have more content. All right. Now, when you take creatine orally and load, it's like a gas tank. On a normal diet with a normal, the body can make a little bit of creatine on its own from different amino acids. Your gas tank's about 50, 60% full. If you're a vegan, it's less. If you're older, it's less. Okay. And so by adding more creatine in the diet with supplementation, I'm now getting that gas tank up to 100%. So I'm filling all the stores up in my muscle, and we also try to increase in brain, so they'll have more phosphocreatine for this energy. Mm-hmm. And there are things you can do to super compensate, almost like the old glycogen loading. If you consume creatine with carbohydrate or protein, you get even more absorbed and faster. So we're doing different things to optimize the storage of creatine in tissue. And even in different types of tissue, some different forms of creatine precursors like GAA actually get in the brain better. And so we're looking at how can we maximize the energy in the cell of ATP and phosphocreatine. And it's particularly important during stressful situations. So sprinting and exercise is obvious, more quality of training. But under disease conditions when there's not enough oxygen, that's the energy system you have to depend upon to prevent injury. For one example, if you get a concussion and you are creatine loaded in animals, have high diet in creatine, the severity of the concussion may be reduced by 30 to 50%. Why? Wow. Because when you get injury, you can't provide oxygen. You have a disruption in the energy availability, and that extra creatine in the brain helps handle that ischemic injury condition. So it reduces the size of the concussion. This is why we're telling military personnel and all athletes, the ISSM position stand, if you're in a sport that is susceptible to concussion, you better be taking creatine just for the neuroprotective effect in case there's a concussion.
Interesting.
And so a lot of those type of medical conditions, ischemic heart disease, stroke, spinal cord injuries, are all related to a lack of energy. And if we restore that energy or have a backup buffer with extra creatine, you can withstand the insult better.
So that leads me to another question, which I wasn't even planning on asking, and just kind of, you probed the thought in my mind of asking the question, which is, so with someone who has some type of heart failure, and let's say that they are taking creatine and they've been taking it, so they've been loaded and they're in their maintenance phase, versus someone who hasn't, and they do have heart failure, they tend to have also scarring with that tissue. Does this mean potentially that the scarring may not be there post the trauma?
Or may not be as large. So, for example, there were studies in the 70s where if you provided heart failure patients and models creatine and phosphocreatine, basically, that it reduced the magnitude of the failure. In other words, improved heart function, reduced arrhythmias. And so when you don't have enough oxygen in your heart cell, there's a small area that's ischemic, right? Mm-hmm. And so if that ischemia lasts long enough, it could actually denature cells and kill cells and cause a lot of acidity increase and breaks and basically causes death to those cells in the heart. If you have creatine, the cells around it that are also ischemic might survive better. So it may be actually a way to reduce the magnitude and size of the infarction or the heart attack. In animal models, we know that this reduces the scarring, the size of the heart attack by inducing it, ischemia, by about 30 to 50%. Same thing is true in a stroke situation in the brain where you have a blockage, you can't get blood flow, you have no oxygen. All of a sudden now the brain has to deal with a lack of energy. If I have this extra source of phosphocreatine, the size of the stroke is less, which means less impact over time. This is why we do this with concussions as well. And so the animal data is very clear. If you have creatine-fed animals and you cause an insult, cause a concussion, cause a spinal cord injury, that you have much less damage because of the creatine. Now, we can't do those studies in humans, obviously, but there are studies, for example, if they have auto accidents and have concussion, a traumatic brain injury, that if they get creatine to the individual quickly in the recovery, the magnitude of the severity is reduced. And so there's a lot of data to support that, although it's harder to prove in humans.
Wow, that's very interesting. So there is an uptake cycle though, right? So, I mean, if I had zero creatine in my body, I wasn't loaded, because there's this loading phase that we'll talk about here in a second. If I don't have that loading phase, but I have, let's say, a concussion, what's that time? Do you know what that time window is, or what is recommended? Because it's going to take some time, right, to get in my bloodstream and get into the blood cells.
So it usually takes about 4 to 5 hours for the blood levels to peak. and then start saturating through the transporters into the tissues. And there's different transporters for different tissues. This is why we tell you for prevention of spinal cord injury, concussion, and stroke, or if you know you're going to go into the hospital and have a heart surgery, there are physicians actually having people go on creatine beforehand, just as a kind of a prophylactic preventive effort. And we know that if you do that, you have higher creatine stores, you should have less damage and you faster recovery, at least in animal models. And so we suggest a bloated if you're going to be any type of sport or any type of condition like that. However, there's also studies showing if you weren't loaded and then you load afterwards, you can also get some of the benefit of helping the cells deal with this lack of energy availability due to the damage, and that the size of the damage may be a little bit less. And so there are all good reasons to do so. And once you saturate the tissues, you don't need as much to maintain it. But we're also finding out that muscle is not the same as the brain. The brain actually may need more. And so we can talk about that.
So is IV treatment maybe a good protocol to those?
It was done in the 1970s, actually. Some of the initial studies on creatine and heart failure were done with intravenous administration of phosphocreatine. And so that's one way to kind of counteract it as well, to get it to the cell quicker. But creatine will peak about an hour after oral ingestion if it's a quality creatine.
So this could be what about ALS or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's?
So the data on neuromuscular diseases is if it affects muscle function, then creatine seems to be a very beneficial thing. If it's more a neural damage, it can't necessarily reverse the damage. So things like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, there's less effectiveness. However, things like Lou Gehrig's disease or things like muscular dystrophies where there's muscle wasting, those seem to be the better applications for those type of neuromuscular disease conditions.
And so basically,
with that said, though, we know that if we increase creatine in the brain, that you have better cognitive function. This is why we're telling elders to take 10 grams a day, 2 times 5 grams in the morning. That's what we're actually doing studies on. Because if you increase brain creatine content, you then can think and handle stress better. And when there's fatigue and even things like sleep deprivation has been shown to be improved with creatine supplementation. Now, the brain's a little different than muscle. Muscle absorbs a lot quickly. It takes a little more to absorb over time for the brain. And so this is why we tell folks, even middle-aged and older, to get cognitive benefits, which is more like 10 grams a day once you've loaded. And for muscle, once you load, you only need probably 5 to 8 grams to be how much muscle mass you have, 0.1 grams per kg. And so the brain needs more. And then we're also doing studies on the precursor to creatine, which is called guanidina acetic acid, GAA. And we know from a series of studies out of Serbia, they've looked at brain changes with administration to GAA, Dr. Serge Ostajic, that only 2 or 3 grams of GAA taken once or twice a day can increase brain creatine content and phosphocreatine content more so than the higher doses of 10 grams a day. And so we're actually combining a little bit of GAA and creatine monohydrate to try to get muscle and brain effects over time in middle-aged and older folks, as there's studies we're doing right now.
So if your body only can produce or hold, well, it can hold whatever you saturate it with, but we're only producing so much phosphocreatine naturally without any supplementation. So how does GAA force some type of adaptation within your body to create more phosphocreatine?
It's because GAA is absorbed through the blood-brain barrier easier than creatine monohydrate, so it gets in the brain. And then once in the brain, there are enzymes that can convert the GAA into creatine. And so you actually have brain creatine transporters as well as brain, the enzymes that are involved in the pathway to convert creatine or synthesize creatine. They're actually in the brain because it's so important of a compound. And if you have some amino acids, it can make a little bit. But if you get GAA, it's a precursor to get that pathway going better. And so therefore, you have more endogenous synthesis of creatine in the brain. And you also can get there with higher doses of creatine. In the neurological diseases like muscular dystrophies and Lou Gehrig's and stuff, the dosages were usually 10 to 30 grams a day.
Wow.
For years. Okay. In fact, in our first few studies that we did way back in the early and mid 90s, it was 16 grams a day for a month. It was 20 grams and 25 grams a day of creatine monohydrate for up to 2 months, 2.5 months, almost 3 months, 84 days.
Wow.
And so we just gave a lot of creatine. And we then learned, okay, well, maybe the muscle gets saturated and you really don't need to have too much more afterwards. That's where we kind of went to the maintenance phase. But we're now finding it that we're thinking of muscle only. The other tissues may need that higher content. And so we're actually going back to the higher dosages, not for muscle, but for the things like brain.
So I want to pause for a second and just break this down because, you know, going back to my initial conversation with the chemistry teacher in high school, we were talking about creatine and creatinine, and he was explaining back then that creatine came from meat. And so a lot of people, I think, believe that or think of the way of this as being some type of meat product that is essentially ground down into oblivion into these, you know, small crystal fibers that are processed and you put it in your shaker cup and you're good to go. Even that maybe not being the case. I also think of this huge movement right now in people getting quality food and things being organic and natural, grass-fed, grass-finished beef versus maybe the mashup of, you know, USDA quality D rated meat from McDonald's that you're getting. To your point earlier, you said nutrition is like the key here. So getting a variation of whether you get this like highly quality product of beef versus a very low quality of beef, your body is going to feel that difference. So is that the same with creatine? I mean, are you checking quality levels, or are you when you're testing, are you going, okay, well, we gave this group this grass-fed version of creatine, and we gave this group the McDonald's version of creatine? How granular can you get, and what is the safety and efficacy of those? Yeah,
so there's about 1 to 2 grams of creatine in a pound of red meat and things like salmon, okay? Mm-hmm. To get enough creatine to get to the levels we're talking about, you need to have pounds per day. And maybe folks up in Alaska, the Eskimos that eat a lot of fish, were getting 4, 5, 6 grams a day. Very hard to do on meat. You'd have to have basically 3 pounds. And so creatine monohydrate is the purest form of creatine. It's synthetic, but it's exactly the same molecule that's in the meat and fish. And so that's easier because you can only need to take one small half a scoop, half a teaspoon, and that gives you the same amount of creatine in like 2-3 pounds of meat. And given the cost of meat today, and the fact that meat has 500 to 1,500 calories per pound, based on what type of meat you're consuming, it's much more effective to use a supplement when it comes to creatine on top of your normal diet that could be high in quality meats and fish and things like that. And so that's why supplementation is a preferred method, because it's just difficult to get that much meat and fish and be very expensive to do. Now, is there different types? One, it's a creatine monohydrate is a water with creatine. It's the same molecule. As the body treats it the same, metabolizes it the same, and stores it the same. Okay. Now, there are other types of creatine that aren't as effective as creatine monohydrate. But if you're taking a quality creatine monohydrate, pure creatine, you're going to get the same thing that's in the meat without all the calories, basically.
Is there a concern over things not being bioidentical? I know that's especially in the hormone replacement therapy sector. You hear this all the time. I'm not getting bioidentical hormones, and it's 50-50 on the fence with that one. What about creatine?
No, not for creatine, because creatine molecule is so basic and it's identical as what's in the body and synthesizes. So the body really can't distinguish between supplemental creatine monohydrate or the creatine it gets from meat. It's still going to metabolize and store it the same way. In fact, their initial studies compared creatine monohydrate put into a drink versus in lozenges versus compared to a pound of meat. And a pound of meat might have 1 to 2 grams of creatine. If you have the same, it's still increased in the blood the same, still has the creatine levels go up the same way, still stores the same amount, so it's identical. So now the question about grass-fed, not if the way they raise animals affects the muscle mass, you may have more creatine in active, almost like muscle building, active animals versus those that are kind of pent up. But I've not seen any studies showing that, the creatine content in a animal that's caged versus grass-fed has a large amount of differences in the creatine content. But theoretically, if there's more muscle mass, especially red muscle mass or salmon going upstream, very metabolically active tissue, muscle, that tends to store more creatine.
So more active the meat or the animal, which would be like pasture raised cattle, versus like a grain fed stuck in a barn.
Yes, that makes sense. I'm not sure whether that would make a difference between, if you had one product of this, if it's the amount of creatine you consume is really the key.
Okay. So I've got a couple creatine products here. I've got this naked creatine, 100% premium creatine monohydrate with nothing to hide. There's, one ingredient, no artificial sweetener, GMO free, certified gluten free. I always love it when they do that. Vegan. But I don't see anything on here about like how it's been tested or, if there's any other products in here or how it's been processed. Is there anything to be concerned about or how maybe you test those things because it is made in the lab?
Yes and no. Depending on the processing methods, is why we recommend the creatine from Germany, which is Pure. It's by far the purest type of creatine out there without any manufacturer, processing derivatives in it that has any negative effects. And something gets NSF certified and it's been checked for other type of, banned substances, especially if it's an athlete that might get tested, is wise. And so we always tell folks to consume creatine as the purest form. There are some differences. There's primarily 2 places you can produce creatine. One is in Germany, which is the purest. That's where 95% of all studies have been done on. And that's what we know works and safe. Then there's some stuff from China, which batch by batch may vary with these metabolites that may not be good. Sometimes they'll test out okay. Sometimes they won't. You can ask for the inspection of the impurities and things. That's generally not quite as pure. So we always tell folks, go with the pure version. The company Korea Pure, that's actually Allschem. I'm an advisor for them, but they produce a high quality, tested, free of contaminants version that just about all the main brands will use, and that's what's been studied.
Okay.
So I would watch for impurities, and I would stay away from, especially creatine made in China, because it's kind of going up and down. After that, as long as it's a pure creatine, creates a creatine to the body. It's almost like natural vitamin C versus synthetic vitamin C. It's a vitamin C. It's a chemical compound that the body recognizes and will store effectively. And so I think that's where you look for is third-party certification on any product that you take, especially if you're a high school or college athlete, where somebody might get tested for, performance-enhancing drugs, like Olympian or something. For the average person, that's not as much a concern, but you get what you pay for. So go for the higher quality supplements that are proven to be effective.
What about crealkaline, creatine HCl, creatine nitrate? I mean, there's so many versions of this.
Yeah.
Is it just a label that it's marketing?
We've actually studied a bunch of those type of forms, compared them directly to creatine monohydrate. We have a paper that we published a couple years ago on bioavailability of these different types of forms. By far, the gold standard is creatine monohydrate, particularly the pure form. Some of these others, if it actually increases creatine in the blood, you might have some effect, but when you bind creatine or co-ingest it with something, you're providing less creatine per gram. So creatine monohydrate is bound to water. About 80% of it, actually 88% is actual creatine, versus something like crealkaline or creatine alpha S, it's more like a 50-50, or creatine nitrate more like a 50-50, 60-50, or 40 type of thing. So you'd have to make sure that you consume the same amount of actual creatine on these other forms. Then the question is, are they bioavailable? A few things are, like creatine alpha ester, creatine HCl, crealkaline a little bit, creatine nitrate. They will increase creatine levels, but unless you're consuming 1 or 2 times more than what the label is, you're not going to get enough. And what they often do will say, ours is more effective, so you don't need to take as much.
Right. I've seen it.
So they basically say, instead of 5 grams, you only need to take 1.5 grams of ours because it's more bioavailable. And the actual studies do not have any evidence to support that. In fact, most of the studies show less absorption of creatine when you take the same gram amounts. We've actually done studies where we did recommended level and then matched it to what the gram per gram would be for creatine, and they show less storage of creatine, therefore less efficacy. And the other thing is, we just did a major paper on safety, just published it. And we looked at all the type of forms. 95% of all studies on creatine, almost over 1,000 clinical trials, have looked at creatine monohydrate from Germany. Only 5% have looked at these other forms. And of the side effects reported, almost none with creatine monohydrate. But at least in the internet, we found an uptick from the creatine hydrochloric acid, which the acid may cause more issues with some people. So, why go with something that's not been tested when something has been tested? Now, some of my folks that I run into, they're selling these different products. Oh, ours is better. Where's your data? And when you compare it to actual creatine monohydrate's beating them every time.
So this one here, I have crealkaline. This is a mix. It was caffeine free, and I've read some studies about mixing caffeine with creatine and the potential downside of that. But they've got all kinds of things in here. And they're using crealkaline, and then a magnesium creatine chelate as another one. So I see a lot of these different products. I remember there was a product called Ultimate Orange years ago that I used to take, and it had creatine in it, but it also had caffeine in it, and it also had glucose in it, which I think was the uptake tool to try and transport that creatine. On that note, I was going to ask you earlier about this. You'd mentioned that most notably you see individuals taking creatine, they have more muscle mass. Do you think that is due to, how is that being measured? Because I'm thinking, if I'm taking creatine and there's more movement into the cell because I'm also taking creatine with a product that has maybe glucose in it that's helping that uptake, I'm naturally going to fill my cells with water. So am I just becoming bloated and I'm not necessarily more muscular?
Good question. No, that's kind of a myth. So It is true that when you consume creatine monohydrate and it goes into the muscle, it takes a little bit of water, just like if you store glycogen, carbohydrate in the muscle. And one of the factors that affect hypertrophy is actually cellular hydration. And so this used to be a big thing called cell volumization, and we do things like glutamine and different things to try to increase the fluid in the cell. But that's not extracellular fluid. And when you gain 10 pounds of muscle is 80% water. So you're only going to add about 10 pounds, 2 pounds of actual protein to that 10 pounds. So there have been studies, we've done a number where we actually looked at muscle mass gains with X-ray methods and compared that to the hydration changes. And every time we have our studies, we look at percentage water of the total weight gain. Mm-hmm. And so if you just look at total water, it'll go up a little bit, but that's because you're building muscle. If you look at the percentage of water, it stays the same. In other words, you're not becoming hyperhydrated to any degree. And then when they've done biopsies and actually looked at what happens to the tissue, there's greater protein being added to myosin and heavy chain muscle and things like that, where you're actually putting protein in. And so there's a myth that it's just water. Maybe the first few days is primarily water, but that seems to be a stimulus for some of the hypertrophy. Mm-hmm. And then if you take it during training, it's actual muscle as measured from standard body composition tests as well as muscle biopsies to look at protein content in the tissue.
So I have this my own little formula for the amount of protein that you consume. And this is based on the research articles that are out there. Amount of protein you consume per gram or gram of protein per kilogram of body weight. And, it's 0.8 to 1.6 is a lot of the research says per kilogram of body weight. And based on strength training and proper exercise, there's something that I've seen over the years where you can kind of gauge how much muscle someone might put on per week or per month. And what I've come down to is about 0.3 grams of lean tissue mass. Okay, now that's not necessarily the muscle itself, but just lean tissue mass. So with creatine, do you guys have a number of what it would be that you could actually increase? So you go with that standard,
So the studies, we always compare it to placebo with the resistance training and the hypertrophy studies.
Okay.
So any change we want to see is over and above the normal training adaptation. And it has to be statistically significantly above, meaning just about everybody responded positively in a proper magnitude and effect. And so if you just did resistance training, most people can gain, studies show, about a third to a half a pound of muscle a month. Okay. All right. If you take creatine, you almost double that. So if you take creatine, for example, studies show, and you took it for a month, our initial studies, our athletes taking creatine would gain 2.4 kgs of muscle mass versus only about 1.1 kg with heavy training. And so it's about doubling the effect. And then, as you go along, we've had folks on, if we really are trying to put weight on athletes to move them to a position to put, more muscle on them, we do heavy resistance training and we do 3 shakes a day, lots of protein with creatine. And we typically have about 6 to 8 grams of creatine per protein drink. And that was our first few studies we did. So the biggest change, and we had athletes that with DEXA, the X-ray method, over a year put on 30 to 40, 50 pounds of muscle.
Wow.
And 48 pounds of it was muscle and only 2 pounds of fat. And so it's not bulking up. It's actually allowing the muscle to have the energy to really adapt with the extra protein, with the greater energy capabilities, leading to much more greater gains of muscle mass. And so even our studies that we show, we do it a month, 2 months, it only affects, it's an extra kg, an extra 2 pounds or something like that. Well, that's a lot. But when you take this over time, you end up having a lot more muscle mass if you're really trying to build.
And there was nothing else, no other enhancements included in that? It was creatine and protein?
Creatine, carbohydrate protein powder. It was kind of like the old metrics. It was actually the Phosphocreatine stuff we studied with EAS. It's like the old metrics, and we added creatine to it.
Wow.
and basically carbohydrate protein, vitamin fortified, just typical carbohydrate protein, high quality protein. And so they're adding, 20, 30 grams of protein per shake. So they're getting, 50, 40, 50, 60 grams of protein added to their diet. And they're getting in that 1.8 to 2 grams per kg per day. But they also had 20 grams of creatine. And we actually saw that if we'd had one group with 20 grams per day with that carbohydrate protein drink, and then another group with 25, they even got better effects on 25. And we did studies where, as well, with creatine effects, let's add creatine to different types of proteins. And so we did whey, and we did, we even did one study with colostrum, which is a really high quality protein. And we found more effects from training with adding creatine to those type of protein drinks. So when we try to put athletes and get them big, so we have an athlete that is a tight end, and they're not going to make an NFL in a tight end, but if they move to offensive tackle, they can make a lot of money because they're fast and got good feet. I've had 2 or 3 athletes over the years at Memphis and Baylor where we purposely put on 30, 40 pounds over a good year and a half training so that they could move to offensive line. And, they're still 6'5", 6'6". They're now 310, 320, 315 as an offensive tackle, but they're fast because they had the speed as a tight end. And then they end up as really big, high draft picks, okay? Several all pros. But it's systematic training, high protein, adding creatine to really get that big effect.
What, I'll close this out. I could talk about this stuff with you for a long time because I'm fascinated by it. What is it that you would say about the safety of this? I mean, a lot of people are concerned about, maybe their kidneys or kidney failure, how this might affect them, right? If they're listening to this and they're going, man, I want to put on another 30 pounds or another 50 pounds. But you're also talking about a person who's already pretty large to begin with. How do you measure or gauge what's safe for them?
Well, there's now been well over 1,000 clinical trials, many on athletes during training, many now in diseased populations given chronically, over 1,000 other articles written about creatine in the published peer-reviewed literature. We just did a safety study, just published it about a month ago, and we looked at all the clinical trials, and we looked at how many reported side effects in creatine-containing supplements versus non-creatine containing supplements, because we all have a placebo, okay? And we compiled 685 studies, and we had 13,000 taking placebos and 13,000 or change taking creatine. And we looked at every reported side effect, if anything was reported. And if there was, we counted how many of the participants and whether the study showed it or not. And if they didn't, we said no. And we did this huge analysis. We came up with absolutely no side effects at all above placebo. Gastrointestinal, no renal function, no abnormalities. And we've also looked at all the clinical populations because there's now a large body of studies that have looked at people with disease, heart disease, renal function. They actually use creatine in dialysis now. So, you look at all the data, it's completely safe. And it's something that's safe not only in younger individuals who are healthy, there are studies now in infants, during pregnancy in infants, all the way to very elder individuals for chronic disease management or preventing loss of muscle and strength as they age. And so if you look at all that body evidence, creatine is probably the safest thing that you can consume as a dietary supplement that we know about. And the benefits far outweigh any potential risk. And so what I tell folks is don't just go on the internet and try to put in there. Even WebMD is wrong on some of the stuff it says about creatine. Look at the literature, look at the studies that have looked at the safety of creatine, and go to our paper and you can see all these things that the incidence is nil. I mean, out of 13,000, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 people may have reported it, but it's the same as the placebo. Everything from even GI upset, cramping, all this stuff you've heard about over the years, which is mainly being pushed by companies trying to sell a different form of creatine to try to say, oh, ours works faster, you don't need to take as much, or ours doesn't cause these bloating and side effects. None of the studies show that. And so as long as you're taking high-quality creatine, most studies show it actually has the opposite effect. For example, in the 90s, we heard about cramping, dehydration. Yeah. Well, they did a bunch of studies and actually shows it's a hydration. It helps you handle stress and the heat and reduces cramping and those type of things. And so almost all the studies are opposite of what you'll read on the internet. So we actually have published a couple papers on myths and misconceptions about creatine and go through a lot of these things like, does it affect your kidneys? Does it cause cramping? Does it cause you to dehydrate? Does it create water weight versus muscle? All these basic things that people have talked about, we have outlined in 2 really good papers. They're more conversational, but there's all the literature support.
So I could give this to my kids. My
Absolutely
is 5. I've got one that's 7, soon to be 8, and one that's 13 playing football. And then my parents who are in their 70s.
Absolutely. So here's the thing. We just published this other paper on safety. There are now NHANES database analysis of the effects of creatine in the diet. NHANES is that big longitudinal study on health that many people have heard about. So kids who have less creatine in the diet, less than 1 gram per day, don't grow as fast. So they're shorter. They have more body fat, less muscle mass. The girls, as they go through puberty, have more menstrual cycle irregularities. Okay. As you age, older folks who don't have more than 1 gram of creatine in the diet are associated with poor cognitive function, depression, and a lot of a greater risk to things like heart failure and certain diseases that are affecting more chronic disease. And we know now that if you add creatine to diet to things like diabetics while they're training or elderly as they're doing resistance training, it can even slow down bone loss in women. There's lots of these great effects now we're learning about the health benefits. So we just did a press release with the International Society of Sports Nutrition. And the reason we did is because some states are trying to say, oh, well, we don't want kids to be able to take creatine or any other muscle building supplements because it may make them want to have eating disorders or some relationship. And so we got so tired of hearing this, we put out a position statement with creatine facts. And we basically said there is no reason that people throughout the lifespan shouldn't be consuming at least 2 to 3 grams creatine per day just for the health benefits. And all these things you hear about are just not supported in any of the scientific literature. So kids, my daughter-in-law took it during 3rd trimester pregnancy because there's all these data studies showing that kids, moms, as the baby develops, the baby takes more creatine from the mom. Mom has to have more in the diet to maintain her creatine levels as well as supply the baby as developing. And if in animals, at least, if they pre-feed creatine during the 3rd trimester and they have problem with birth, natural birth, or asphyxia, like a blue baby with a cord coming right out, that the survival rate's almost 50 to 60% better.
Wow.
So my daughter-in-law took it, and she had a challenging, unexpected, a little bit premature birth, and the kid came out. The doctors could not believe how strong this kid is. And so my kids have been on it throughout their training. They still, my parents are on it. If you're not taking creatine, it's because you just don't know the science. It's just that's important. In fact, we think creatine may become the next folate for women.
I see. I now see marketing, and maybe it's just convenience, right? So I'm seeing these, and now these are getting slapped on with labels that say, it's a pink label and it's made for women. Is there any difference? Is it just, here you go, it doesn't matter what it is? I could rip the label off and everybody takes the same amount, same dosage.
Yeah, we still recommend 0.1 grams per day to maintain and 0.3 to load grams per kg. Men and women may not differ much, although women tend to be more vegan in their diet, especially if they're trying to lose weight. And so they actually may get more benefit because they have a greater increase in creatine from their baseline. And so we also are finding out Dr. Abby Smith-Ryan at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, do some great studies on timing creatine supplementation around the menstrual cycle. because there seems to be some really beneficial effects of alternating nutrients on the menstrual cycle to get better training adaptations for women and health. And we also know postmenopausal women is very important to help with bone maintenance. And so there's lots of potential benefits. So really no difference in the type of creatine you take or the amounts, because as long as you take relative doses, it's kind of based on size, which is okay. But we know that the word's got to get out. Creatine's very important for women's health as they mature, as they go through their lifespan, because there are certain times of physiological stress, childbearing, all these different things that happen that place even more demands on the female and probably have a greater need than even a male.
Dr. Kreider, I got to tell you, super helpful. I loved having you on, and your work in this field has been instrumental, I think, in getting the knowledge and the science out there. So I really appreciate your time today. Dr. Kreider didn't just validate creatine. He gave us the truth when the world was still caught up in fear. And if you're still scared that creatine is synthetic, you're totally missing the point. Your body already makes it. The lab didn't invent it. It just made it accessible. So before you jump on a trend or avoid something out of fear, ask better questions. Because the difference between peak performance and wasted potential might just be a scoop away, if you know what you're doing. Thanks for joining. As always, if there's someone out there that can benefit from this show, go ahead and share it. I always say my kids say sharing is caring, so please share with others. Thank you for watching and or listening, and I'll catch you guys on the flip side.